talking about Edgar Allan Poe. Not Dashiell Hammett, not yet. We'll get to him in just a minute. But Edgar Allan Poe, in 1841, published a story called The Murders in the Rue Morgue, featuring an interesting man named Auguste Dupin. He's French, so you get that little snobby nasal sound in there, Auguste Dupin. And Auguste Dupin is basically our first detective. Edgar Allan Poe wrote about a black bird called the Raven, but he also wrote about this guy who went around solving mysteries. And he did it using intelligence, he did it using a vast storehouse of knowledge inside his head, and more than a little courage, perhaps, in some instances. So we have to thank Edgar Allan Poe for giving us detective stories, and by extension, detective movies like The Maltese Falcon. This sort of thing became very popular very quickly in the late 1800s, especially among the French, and we'll get back to the French later, and the British. And it's really the British who take detective stories into the next level. Probably the best known figure, of course, would be Sir Arthur Conan Doyle with Sherlock Holmes, a figure from the late 1800s. And then by the time we hit the 1920s, 1930s, especially in England, this is the age of the cozy mystery story. People like Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers. And in fact, detective stories have become so formulaic, so predictable, and in many ways so safe. Yeah, usually there's a corpse lying around somewhere, but other than that, it's a nice, safe, cozy genre. You have this mild-mannered detective figuring things out, finally drawing everybody into a room together. There's not that much of a sense of danger. And in many ways, there were some writers who thought, this kind of story can be more than this. There's more to this genre, this kind of storytelling, than this sort of thing. And along comes a magazine in America, one of the pulp magazines. And if you know anything about pulp magazines, you know that pulp magazines were very cheaply produced on pulpwood paper, hence the name. Very formulaic stories a lot of times. But there was one magazine in particular that really stood out above the crowd, especially when it came to crime fiction, and that was a magazine called Black Mask. It began publication in 1921. And Black Mask provided a great forum, as these new magazines often did, for new writers. And as it turned out, there was a new generation of American writers very interested in crime fiction, in detective fiction, and this was a great opportunity for them. Because now here's a new market. This new market is looking for new talent. And so they began publishing, and they did so very successfully. There were a number of writers associated with this, but probably the big three would be Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, and eventually Dashiell Hammett, our boy. Dashiell Hammett, the author of the novel, The Maltese Falcon, which was serialized, in other words, published in installments, chapter by chapter, in Black Mask in the 1920s, and then published in its entirety as a novel in 1929. So there's our literary inspiration for our film, Dashiell Hammett's 1929 novel, The Maltese Falcon. And we'll get back to that in just a second. But meanwhile, in the late 1920s, something very interesting was happening in the movies. And that was specifically the transition from silent films to sound. Movies from their inception in the 1890s had been silent. Not entirely silent, of course, accompanied usually by live musicians within the theaters. And of course, the very history of this theater that we are in, the Paramount, is a good example of a theater that began its construction designed for silent movies and then having to scramble somewhat to adapt to the new sound movies that were coming in, and it did so very successfully. It's a model example of that type of transition. But this changed the industry, and in many ways it changed the movies, not just because now you could have music and dialogue, but this changed a lot of other things as well. For instance, content. It used to be the case that there was very little dialogue, of course, in movies, because either you have to get very good at reading lips, or you have to rely on the intertitles, these bits of dialogue and other words interspersed to understand what's going on. Of course, you don't need that with sound films, but now Hollywood not only had to worry about the public's concerns over content with what people could see, but now finally also what they could hear. So it's not really a big surprise that early in the history of sound movies, there was a lot of concern about inappropriate language, suggestive language, etc. And so we get the establishment of a code, a self-enforced industry standard for what could and could not be said in a motion picture. And they did this mostly to avoid government censorship. This means that when they started adapting literary properties with inappropriate language for the code, that they had to sanitize it a little bit. And in fact, that's the case with the Maltese Falcon. The Maltese Falcon from 1941 is very much a product of the production code years of Hollywood. And to read the novel is a somewhat different experience. They're very similar in terms of story and in terms of the main characters. But the novel is a lot rougher. And there's a lot of language in the novel that Hammett could get away with because there weren't those kinds of restrictions on publishing in 1929 that there were in the movies in 1941. So, one thing to be aware of, yes, it's a literary adaptation, but because of the way Hollywood was in 1941, it couldn't work as well, at least in terms of being as faithful to the novel as it could have been. However, the 1941 film adaptation of The Maltese Falcon is not the first. Warner Brothers snapped up the property like that almost immediately after Hammett had published it. And in 1931, just 2 years after the novel came out, there was a film adaptation. Now, most people have never heard of the 1931 Maltese Falcon. And there may be some reasons for that, partly because it was overshadowed by the film we're going to watch. But, and I have to refer to my notes here, because these people are so obscure that I can't even remember who they are. The 1931 Maltese Falcon was directed by Roy Del Ruth, a decent journeyman director, but not exactly an immortal name. And as the main character, Sam Spade, Ricardo Cortez. Has anybody here ever heard of Ricardo Cortez? Maybe a few, but again, not a household name. Well, it did okay, the 1931 film did, but Warner Brothers thought that really the property could have more success. So the relative lack of success for the 31 version did not deter them. And part of what worked in their favor was what was known as the studio system. Back in the 1930s and into the 1940s, the studios were a lot more financially secure and powerful than they are today. And basically they had everybody under contract. They had directors under contract, they had screenwriters under contract, they had actors under contract, and so on, down to, the key grip and the best boy. Everybody was under contract. Which meant that basically they could go with a project and assign their contracted workers to it